Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and this week we're looking at how to improve the discourse of election campaigns. In particular, in settings where votes are often traded for services, how can competition be nudged to focus more on policies designed to serve the public good? Hello, my name is Alan Rennick, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. Democratic elections ideally involve vibrant and earnest discussion of the challenges and opportunities facing the nation and the policies that might best address them. Yet real-world elections rarely seem to fulfil those hopes. One of the alternative realities found in many countries today is the politics of clientelism, where candidates effectively buy votes by rendering services to particular individuals, families, or other groups within society. It's pretty clear that clientelistic politics is harmful, but how can systems where such practices are entrenched be nudged towards more so-called programmatic competition based on competing policy visions? Well, a new article explores the potential role of election debates, or as we might call them in traditional UK political parlance, election hustings, where local candidates come together to debate the issues. It draws on evidence from some remarkable experiments conducted in Liberia, and it throws up some intriguing findings. One of the co-authors of that article is Jeremy Bowles, lecturer in comparative politics here in the UCL Department of Political Science, and I'm delighted that Jeremy joins me now. Jeremy, welcome back to UCL Uncovering Politics. It's great to have you on again. And let's start with the problem that you're seeking to address in this paper. I said a little bit there about different forms of competition that can characterize election campaigns, but how would you describe those different forms of competition?
Sure. So the two ideal types to sort of have in mind, as you alluded to in the introduction, would be, on the one hand, modes of programmatic political competition, and on the other hand, modes of clientelistic competition. And so programmatic is sort of what we might think of as being present in, most of the time in most developed democratic settings, where candidates have some sort of clearly publicized policy platform that is disseminated at scale to voters, and that voters make their decisions on the basis of policy platforms, or on the basis of parties that hold a sort of a similar set of stances on public issues and priorities. On the other hand, there's clientelistic competition, which we tend to find more often in developing democratic settings, where voting instead is done on the basis of people often refer to as sort of contingent particularistic transfers, for example, where you vote for somebody because they've offered you some kind of private transfer, maybe money in the most obvious case with vote buying, for example, or because they sort of provide you transport to a polling station, or they're going to give you something to your particular community. And so rather than voting for candidates or parties on the basis of a broad policy platform, it's a more sort of privately centered mode of voting, where campaigns are defined more by sort of local rallies, by giving out money and cash to voters, rather than by debating broader policy issues facing your community or the country at large. And there's a lot of evidence from different papers and different settings to suggest that clientelistic modes of competition are sort of bad news for different measures of development outcomes, because if you're competing on the basis of vote buying, for example, you're likely not going to get the right kind of person in power who might be able to, make broader sort of policy changes to the national environment. Similarly, it's harder to hold these people to account if you're not expecting them really to actually provide you with public goods, and it's more about, for example, cash. And so there's a lot of work out there understanding what are the underpinnings of clientelism, and what are the implications as well.
And your work that we're talking about today focuses on Liberia. So how does clientelism function in Liberia?
Yeah, so people would typically think of Liberia as being a very clientelistic political system. It's a stable democracy, fairly remarkably so, given the horrendous civil wars from which it only exited about 20 years ago. But it has quite vibrant election campaigns. However, these are very clientelistic in nature. Parties are quite weak, and there's no real sense at the legislative level, at the sort of parliamentary level, that there are particularly clear policy platforms for parties. Instead, certainly at the legislative level, campaigning is really typically about candidates holding local rallies and buying votes and trucking voters to polling booths. And so some of the survey evidence, for example, that we talk about in the paper is that it's around like a third to a half of all voters are offered money to vote for somebody. Similarly, much of Liberia is incredibly rural, and it's very tough to get to polling stations. And so it's very widespread practices of basically trucking voters to different polling stations to sort of tell them who to vote for and potentially monitor them as they do that. And there's really little sense in which candidates make sort of policy promises about what they're going to do to their constituency at large. Instead, because campaigning tends to be done, in sort of village to village to village, a lot of campaigning is really about like, what am I going to give to you? And then moving to the next village and maybe saying the same thing to all of, at the same time. And there's very little sense in which much campaigning is done, at least traditionally on the basis of credible policy promises.
How is this seen in Liberia? Is it seen as a problematic feature of election campaigns that people want to have?
Yeah, no, for sure it is. And Liberia is an interesting country for many reasons. But it's an interesting one in that like elections on the whole are extremely cleanly run in spite of all of this. Much of that is because of the legacy of the fact that most of their, until this study was done in 2017, but there was a heavy UN involvement in running elections post-civil wars. And the legacy of that has been actually the Electoral Commission and so on. It's actually quite a strong institution. Like elections are pretty clean. However, campaigning is done on the basis of, more often on the basis of sort of a lot of vote buying, trucking, and so on. It also naturally sort of shifts your expectations of what you expect from your representatives if you're voting for them on the basis of handouts rather than policy promises. And so there's, for example, we look in the paper at the characteristics of candidates, and they are they're spending like a lot of money on these campaigns, at least partially because they're also paid unbelievably well. It's like hundreds of thousands of dollars. Liberia is one of the world's poorest countries that they're paid as legislators. And so the whole sort of, at least at the legislative level, is sort of set up around the expectation of getting money from candidates and in turn potentially not expecting that much when broad policy changes aren't enacted when they're elected. In response to this, lots of both CSOs and a lot of international NGOs who work in the country run initiatives around elections to try and sort of improve the supply of candidates or nudge things in a more programmatic direction, which is part of what we're studying in this study.
So the nudge that you are focusing on in this study is an intervention relating to election debates. So the idea here is that getting candidates to participate in election debates might lead to more of a programmatic focus of competition. Can you just kind of take us through the logic? Why would we think that election debates would have this effect? I guess I come from, following election debates in the UK and the US and places like that, where people are always complaining that there's no serious debate about policy in these debates, that it's always just people shouting at each other. Yeah. But your argument is that no, more election debates are good for programmatic competition. So what's the logic here?
So, I think that's certainly true in the US. I feel like the UK ones are reasonable policy content, but point taken. So I think that the difference is that this is a setting in which, absent these kind of interventions, there's very little access to sort of credible policy information about their priorities for the constituency at large, rather than these sort of locally excludable sort of rally-based promises of, everyone's going to get stuff. And so it's in a setting where actually otherwise there are relatively few ways to really understand the policy priorities of candidates outside of these kind of interventions, where features of the debates that we actually study here sort of enhance that, because they were to begin with, they were all broadcast by the radio, by community radio, which is the most popular sort of form of sort of media consumption, at least at the time of these elections. So, everybody across the constituency can listen to the same thing being said by the candidates. Secondly, the structure of these, we partnered with an international NGO called Internews on these, who was sort of administered these debates. They were meant to be focusing primarily on eliciting policy promises. So this wasn't meant to be as much about like people attacking each other and ad hominem kind of attacks from different candidates, but it's meant to be more focused on like, what are you going to do? What are your top priorities for local development in the constituency? Which is really the core of campaign. The core of most voters want is sort of public goods, access to infrastructure, and so on. And so the structure of these debates was completely, in a sense, quite boring, because it was not meant to be too much about showboating. It was meant to be more about like eliciting policy information and then broadcasting it at scale in a way that's quite easy to evaluate across different candidates, because you can listen to all of their responses at the same time. And it's a setting where otherwise that would be very hard to do for voters.
So you're conducting an experiment here as an experimental intervention in real world politics in Liberia, but you're able to control to a significant degree just the nature of these debates.
Clear.
So they're not, they're not going to be US style debates that are just shouting matches. Yeah. Okay. And so what were you expecting to find?
Yeah. So I can go a bit more. So the sort of the structure of these debates was that you'd have all of the candidates running for the House of Representatives in Liberia, which was, on average, think of it like 10 candidates running ish per race.
And this is single member districts.
Single member districts.
So first post.
Yep. First past post elections, a long tail of people who run not because they think they're actually going to win, but just because they want to get favors post election potentially, or elevate their profile, such that there are only a handful of particularly credible candidates per race. And so this came about because I spent a summer in Liberia in 2017 during my PhD, sort of ahead of their elections, and came across this international NGO, Internews, which wanted to run these sort of debates across every constituency of Liberia's sort of 73 electoral districts. And they wanted to run these in a fairly standardized way, partnering with local journalists, but where these debates were mostly about policy and then a bit about the kind of like local issues as well, moderated by their sort of Liberian partner organizations, pretty small in-person audiences, but then lots of radio rebroadcasting to make sure that everyone can hear what the different candidates have had to say.
So each of these debates within the local area is being rebroadcast multiple times. Yeah. So lots of people are going to hear it.
Exactly, because the international NGO which actually ran the debates, their main sort of role is around media development, around sort of independent media strengthening. And so they were running this, and they had a big network of community radio stations across the country, which they contracted with to rebroadcast all of these debates, I think on average like 5 or 6 times. And these debates are often quite long, particularly concentrated right around the election. So in the sort of couple of weeks before the election. And so I started talking to them when I was there, trying to think about, what they're interested in, what they're concerned about with this intervention, and what might be interesting to work together to evaluate some sort of theoretically interesting aspects of running these things in Liberia for the first time, because these things have never been run before prior to this election at this level, and certainly at this scale. And so what we kind of settled on, and what is sort of also particularly interesting for thinking about from the perspective of your introduction and the notes about sort of programmatic versus clientelist competition, is to think about like their main concern was that candidates wouldn't want to do this, wouldn't want to participate in these debates, particularly candidates who are doing quite well already in Liberian politics, i.e. like incumbents, for example. The most credible challenging candidates would be like, well, first of all, why do I want to spend a day out on my busy campaign to go and like do this sort of radio debate? Secondly, especially if I'm an incumbent, why do I just want to have my record attacked by all these challenges? Thirdly, potentially candidates not knowing how good they would be at this type of, question and answer on the basis of policy rather than traditional campaigning, such that like the main concern of the international NGO, and this happens in all sorts of debates across the world, is that candidates like wouldn't show up, and it would undermine the whole point of the initiative about sort of informing voters and showing them what candidates actually want to do, or getting access to their sort of policy priorities. So what our sort of intervention here was, within this broader intervention, this broader initiative, was to vary the sort of the effort exerted by that the partnering NGO would exert to try and get a higher share of candidates to come into these debates in a constituency. Because there are lots of examples, in the US, the UK, everywhere, of incumbents being like, I can't be bothered to debate with this person, it's only downside for me. And so what we did was to basically, at random, across half of the electoral districts in the country, the partner NGO exerted substantially more effort to try and like persuade, in various different ways, to try and get more of these candidates to show up, to actually participate in this thing. And particularly our expectation was that these efforts would lead for a higher share of sort of leading candidates. So like incumbents, the most credible challengers to show up.
Mm-hmm.
The rationale being that for these like very, the more marginal tail of candidates, this is sort of all upside. They don't, they're not going to win either way. It's sort of, betting on this, on this debate. There's more of a present downside if you're probably quite adapted to campaigning already. So there's more clientelistic campaigning and you have more to lose from participation if it goes badly. And so basically the intervention was to persuade these more leading candidates to turn up. We did this through a couple of different ways. Most interestingly by getting a very famous Liberian radio journalist to phone up literally hundreds of these candidates to persuade them by appealing to their democratic duty.
The paper, how on earth did you manage to get this?
Yeah, it was because of the partner NGO has worked with a lot of these radio journalists who are genuinely very famous, and one of them was working on this initiative, and so she had a long history from Bush radio during the Civil Wars, and she's like a legend in the country, and she agreed to basically to call hundreds of these candidates to both like appeal to a sense of duty, but also to clarify that this wasn't going to be about interpersonal attacks. This was more about policy priorities. We didn't tell them the questions, but we said, this is what you should be preparing. You might think it's going to be them all attacking you, but no, this is about showcasing your policy platforms. Mm. And so the idea was that essentially experimenters is to say like, okay, in half of the districts, we have a greater share of these leading candidates who are turning up to debate. And in the other half, we have probably more of this sort of leading, this long tail of slightly more marginal candidates who are participating, to think of like, okay, using this nudge, what does this say about what determines whether voters pay attention to these initiatives? And secondly, what can we infer about the sort of the calculus for the candidates in deciding whether to do this, whether to opt in to this slightly more programmatic form of competition or sort of describing and publicize and broadcasting at scale your policy priorities compared to campaigning as normal.
Yeah. So the expectations that you had going into the experiment, just to set out what you were looking out for there.
I mean, ultimately, we're interested in thinking about the electoral benefits to candidates. So you could think here of, I'm a leading candidate in this quite clientelistic political system. The ideal experiment would be sort of have experimental variation in whether you nudge an incumbent, for example, to turn up and debate or not, and to use that to say like, okay, comparing electoral outcomes across these areas where these leading candidates show up and not, to say like, okay, what are the incentives facing these candidates to actually participate in more programmatic competition?
You're presuming that the debate is more programmatic.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then you're trying to understand how can you actually get serious candidates to engage in.
Yeah. And so, and because like a broader motivation here is to think about, okay, why is clientelistic competition so sticky? Like, why is it so pervasive? And one thing which we're sort of going for in the paper is to think about is like, well, maybe it's actually because most of the candidates are not particularly well adapted to competing on programmatic grounds. There's some, very heterogeneous benefits to competing on programmatic grounds. And so that you sort of a coordination among candidates on competing along more clientelistic dimensions rather than more programmatic forms of competition. And so what we're thinking about here is like, okay, well, one way to get at that is to say like, do you do better in terms of voters' perceptions of you, in terms of your actual electoral outcomes if you participate in this thing or not, as one of these candidates who sort of emerged in this clientelistic sort of equilibrium and is well adapted to traditional campaigning in Liberia. So like, what are the electoral benefits to you? And so our main sort of interest was in thinking about the electoral consequences of participation at the candidate level. A sidebar here is sort of to do with ethics, which is that we didn't randomize this at the candidate level because ex ante it wasn't totally clear whether it would be unfair to some candidates in a district to try really hard to invite candidate 1 but not candidate 2 at random. And if it turned out,
So you're inviting everyone, but it's the intensity of the invitation.
it's the intensity at the race level.
Yeah.
And our expectation was that these appeals would probably have a bigger effect on these leading candidates within the race.
Yeah.
We're not randomizing at the candidate level, because then if it turns out, as it kind of did, that this had quite large electoral consequences, then it's less ethically defensible compared to what we did, which was everything is at the sort of the race level. So think of it as you got like a higher proportion of these leading candidates in race A, a lower proportion in race B.
But so by race, you mean constituency? District.
Exactly, in District A versus District B. And so expectations-wise, basically we sort of, as running as a field experiment, you pre-register lots of things and then you sort of see what comes out. And our main expectations are really that this would be the electoral benefits to participating in a debate for one of these sort of leading candidates would depend on the extent of their policy alignment with voters, with their constituents, which we measure using large-scale surveys and so on, before and after the elections and the initiatives. And secondly, on a measure of how well they fare in the debate itself, i.e. that these debates, there's some aspect of demonstrating competence, of being like, a better candidate than others. Secondly, if you reveal that your priorities, which here, think of these as like priorities over allocations of spending on public goods. So, we need more schools in this area and we need more hospitals in this bit of the constituency. That it really will depend on the extent of these two things, sort of predicted performance and secondly, policy alignment. Then we have like a few things to think about, like, okay, and I can talk about the results in a sec, but like to think about like, okay, we also expected that voters would pay more attention to these initiatives when more of these candidates turn up. Because, it's certainly if you have like an incumbent showing up, you're more likely to know who they are and to use that as sort of a benchmark to evaluate other candidates. And we had some expectations over whether that participation in this kind of initiative might act as a sort of a boost to other forms of campaigning. So if you participate in this debate, then maybe you're more likely to be invited onto other radio shows, for example. It's going to be like a complement to your campaigning effort. Potentially, on the other hand, if you are broadcasting your policy priorities at scale, that might actually hinder your ability to campaign in this more localized, village to village type of approach. And so it might actually limit your ability to do more like traditional on the ground campaigning, to the extent that these policy promises are sort of binding your hands over what you can say.
Okay, fantastic. So a range of different expectations there.
Yep.
The crucial question, as always, is what did you find?
What happened? So the overall sort of the high level electoral result here was basically that from nudging a higher share of these candidates, or these top candidates to participate, the people who really benefited were incumbents who participated at the lowest rates overall. Mm-hmm. Only about half of the incumbents across the country actually showed up to these debates. Mm-hmm. A higher share of these more marginal candidates showed up, as I alluded to before. And basically, when you nudge a greater share of these incumbents to participate, they are the ones who actually electorally benefited the most. On the other hand, and this kind of came at the cost of their sort of leading challenger candidates, the other handful in the constituency who were sort of the more credible challengers. So, and this appears both in our voter surveys, but also appears in like actual polling station level results. Like these debates, as I said, were broadcast a lot in our voter survey. Like a good sort of third of the voters had heard these debates at least once. They had quite a large electoral impact because something like this had never been done before, and so we find results both in the voter survey but also in actual polling station data. Like the vote shares to incumbents in these treated districts are a bit higher, and it's particularly mediated by these things to do with policy alignment, but also sort of predicted performance in debates. And so why? Yes.
So I mean that's quite an important point, though, isn't it? And if we're thinking that the people perform better because they do well when examined through a programmatic lens, as it were, then it's quite important that you can see that someone whose policies align with voters' preferences does indeed do better than someone whose policies don't align with voter preferences. And someone who's seen as being competent and able to deliver effectively, again, is doing better than someone who isn't seen as competent.
Exactly. And that it also speaks to the fact that it's an interpretation of these debates as being quite programmatic, because these are the sort of characteristics you'd expect to be better rewarded under if it was a sort of a programmatic intervention. By contrast, we don't see too much for these leading challengers who, if anything, marginally kind of lose out from being induced to participate. And so to extend kind of the heart of the paper is to think about, like, why is this? Why are we... It's not totally clear why this would be, because these incumbents do very well under clientelism. They've already been elected under this sort of more sort of vote buying style equilibrium. When you nudge more of them to show up, why do they seem to benefit under this more programmatic form of competition? And so we have sort of a theoretical framework in the paper and also a bunch of empirical analyses to think about this. But we see there as being basically sort of like three main mechanisms here. The first is that essentially these incumbents were a bit better at knowing when to show up in these debates. And so what we can show in the paper is essentially that the incumbents that we nudged to participate, that were nudged to participate by this intervention, were ones who had a relatively higher extent of alignment and a higher degree of sort of perceived competence compared to the ones who were nudged among these challenger candidates. And so what was happening, and this isn't to say that incumbents overall are better aligned or perceived as more competent. Actually, if anything, it's very similar. They're perceived as being, they're similarly aligned and kind of perceived as similarly competent to a lot of challengers, but they were better at knowing their own sort of proclivity for, or their own capacity at basically participating in this kind of initiative. Potentially that's because they've already been serving in office. They're a bit better used to, what policy platforms look like and how to make appeals and appealing to the experience. But essentially there's some evidence that there was a more sort of positive self-selection of incumbents to show up to these debates in the first place, induced by this sort of experimental variation. Potentially because these incumbents are the ones who, face the greatest downside if they perform badly. And so the only ones who are going to probably agree to participate are the ones who are quite good to start with. And so we still have like 30-40% of these incumbents who don't show up. And these people were very poorly aligned and they would have done very badly if they'd shown up, but you can't force all of these people to show up in a debate.
So a kind of negative way of framing that conclusion, could it potentially be that basically the incumbents are better at gaming or their own participation, whether they can use this form of campaigning to their own ends?
Yeah, so there are two things. To some extent, yes, that you could think of this as maybe being a little bit like more political sophistication in terms of evaluating the cost benefit of agreeing to debate against. And, when they did, we have lots of evidence in the paper that they were kind of the focal point. Like, they were referenced much more often. They spoke a bit more about policy. They were attacked more. And so they sort of, you could think of this as maybe they're a little bit more sophisticated in evaluating the cost benefit of agreeing to debate and supply policy promises at scale. But there are other sides to it too. Like, one is that we talked about quite a bit in the paper is that the nature of these campaigning responses is sort of different between incumbents and challengers, whereby incumbents already have lots of resources and probably don't so obviously need the additional publicity of a debate. If anything, they might just be giving like a platform to their challengers, unless they're pretty sure that they're going to do well. Challengers, on the other hand, maybe they're more resource constrained, and so they're sort of betting on participation, almost like gambling on it more, because if they do well, then it's going to boost their campaign afterwards ahead of the election. And so just like the calculus facing incumbents versus challengers potentially looks a little bit different. However, the high level result is that when we sort of induce these more of these leading candidates to show up, particularly incumbents who electorally benefit, voters pay much more attention and updated about the candidates, and then there are sort of these campaigning spillovers, knock-on effects as well, which varied a bit between incumbents and challengers.
And what do we learn then about this big question about whether this kind of intervention can effectively promote programmatic competition?
Yeah. So I think there are two high-level things to think about. The first is that lots of these types of initiatives exist at quite relatively smaller scales in huge numbers of developing democratic settings. And one of the academic pitches of this paper is that most studies of these sort of initiatives to provide policy information to voters, they exogenize, or they treat as given that politicians are going to provide this information. However, what we're finding in this paper is that when you scale up these sort of interventions, to the national level, you really have to think about what are candidates' incentives to actually agree to participate in this more programmatic type of initiative. And here we're showing that actually they're pretty mixed. There's a lot of variation across the candidate pool, both in terms of whether they might benefit from showing up to a debate, and secondly, their own capacity for formulating and competing on more programmatic grounds. And so one broader takeaway here is that to some extent I don't think the results we get are necessarily negative, because we're encouraging better quality incumbents, the ones who sort of were nudged to participate, but the results of these sorts of initiatives might look quite different as they're scaled up from a town hall to like a constituency-wide radio or televised debate, because of these challenges you have and whether candidates want to comply and actually show up. And this comes out if you look at so many presidential or parliamentary debates where they're almost certainly undermined by the fact that it just doesn't make sense for leading candidates to show up to them. In the US, obviously, Trump refusing to the second debate is one example that comes to mind, because it's sort of, what's the point? The second to think about in terms of a broader takeaway is the fact that the shift to more programmatic modes of political competition might be undermined, yes, by candidate level incentives, but also by candidate level capacity and training and experience in formulating and disseminating and appealing to voters under this type of competition, where what we find, at least with these challenger candidates, is often when they showed up, and we do a lot of analysis of the transcripts, they're saying a lot of things which are basically pretty similar to what the incumbents are saying, or they're sort of like riffing on that rather than formulating distinct policy priorities. And so the second thing to think about here is really about how to strengthen candidate selection processes, potentially within parties, where parties in the setting are not doing that much screening of candidates on the basis of policy platforms, and lots of candidates are independents and so on. And so a second implication here is to really think about sort of initiatives or ways to encourage shifts in the candidate pool, potentially towards candidates who are better able to espouse their policy priorities.
And do I remember that the election that you did this in was in 2017?
That's right, yeah.
So has anything happened in Liberia as a consequence of it?
Yeah, so I mean, this was the... So they had, there was a similar initiative run over the last election, which was 2023, 6-year terms, scaled up by the same partner organization. And the initiative led to have had a few spillover consequences on programming to do with these media partners and how they think about like broadcasting sort of policy promises and election information. There were efforts to take policy information from these debates and actually try and track how well the candidates had actually implemented them, the victorious candidates, which was, I think, was ultimately not that successful, because many of the candidates basically refused to provide additional information about their policy priorities. And so it became quite difficult for this newspaper we were talking to, the Daily Observer, to actually track their policy priorities. And so I think it's sort of mixed, but we spoke quite a lot to the implementing partners around the 2023 elections to disseminate these results to all of the partners many times before that, to talk about an additional implication here actually is really that the need to get the right candidates in the room to enable voters to sort of cast their vote in ways amenable to the intervention, where like a different side of this that we brought out after the study is that these results would have potentially been quite different if every incumbent had shown up, because they were a bit more potentially more sophisticated in knowing when to turn up and not, which means that like these incumbents who didn't turn up to the debates, these are the ones that ideally you kind of need voters to know that they're lower quality potentially and to boot them out. And so one of the implications here is that we try to bring out is to say that you need to, either the media might have to play a role in sanctioning candidates who don't participate in these initiatives, because if they don't, then also voters pay less attention to them. And so it's sort of a win-win. And so a different thing that we try to bring out with the media partners is publicizing more around the participation decision of these candidates to try and get them all to show up. And then to some extent, it would facilitate a bit more of this transition to a more programmatic equilibrium.
This is so fascinating. Thank you. I could keep on asking all sorts of questions, but alas, we are out of time and we'll have to wrap up there. But so interesting to hear about a project that has kind of positive results, but also a bit mixed. There's some things that work as you expect, some things that kind of maybe are a little bit surprising and cause further reflection and further experimentation and further exploration of what might be going on. So really interesting piece of research, and I hope you'll continue to explore these things and tell us more about them in future episodes of the podcast. So thank you so much, Jeremy, for coming on today. We've been discussing the article Who Debates, Who Wins? At-Scale Experimental Evidence on the Supply of Policy Information in a Liberian Election by Jeremy Bowles and Horacio Larraghi. And that article should be out very, very soon in the American Political Science Review. We will, as ever, put full details in the show notes for the episode. Next week, we will be looking at the role of partisanship in UK politics. To make sure you don't miss out that or other future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics, all you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Google Podcasts, or whatever podcast provider you use. And while you're there, we'd love it if you could take a moment of time to rate or review us too. I'm Alan Rennick. This episode was produced by Kaiser Kang and Eleanor Kingwell-Benham. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.